Good afternoon. The first item of business is a member's business debate or motion in the name of Bill Kidd on World Day Against the Death Penalty. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And before you rise, Mr Kidd, can I say at the moment I'm anticipating 7 other members to speak in the debate. We must conclude by 2 o'clock, so I'm afraid must be 4-minute speeches for the open speeches. Mr Kidd, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you to my colleagues who contribute this afternoon to this debate, and to Minister Christina McKelvey, who will be responding on behalf of the Scottish Government. The 10th of October 2019 marked World Death Penalty Day. Unfortunately, we weren't able to hold this debate at that point, but I'm very pleased to bring it to the Chamber now. The day was launched in 2003 by the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty Group, which is represented by many human rights groups internationally. It was founded to strengthen the international fight against the death penalty with the goal of abolition. So I'm glad that you can all be here today to add your voices and thoughts to this ambition. Whilst many strides have been made since the United Nations adoption of the Universal Human Rights Charter, this fundamental right, the right to life, still has to be fought for across the world. Out of 193 member states of the United Nations and 198 countries in the world, 142 have abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. This includes 106 states who have abolished the death penalty for all crimes. 8 countries have now abolished the death penalty for ordinary crimes only, with exceptions placed on crimes committed in times of war. 28 countries could be considered abolitionist in praxis, having not held an execution for the past 10 years and are believed to have a policy or established practice of not carrying out executions. The work of Amnesty International should be highlighted in today's debate. Aside from their political advocacy, the organisation's efforts in international record-keeping ensures that states are kept accountable and that debates like these are grounded by facts. Their records show that 56 countries use the death penalty. Organisations such as Amnesty are essential to the functioning of democracies across the world, as they are key in keeping institutions accountable. This is at the height of importance in an issue such as the death penalty and the operation of justice systems around this issue. In the past year, 20 countries have carried out executions. In 2018, the top 5 executioners were China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam and Iraq. 690 verifiable executions were recorded in this period. This number excludes cases that Amnesty International could not confirm. However, Amnesty does estimate that the number of executions in China in 2018 were in the thousands. China does not release any figures on executions, as figures pertaining to the death penalty remain a state secret. It is clear from these figures that the death penalty is still widely used as a punishment. In countries around the world, it is used not only in cases of capital crimes, such as murder and terrorism, it is also used for other purposes, such as suppression of groups of people and political opinion, discrimination and suppression of individuals on grounds of their sexuality, religious belief, race, ethnicity, or for advocating human rights or women's rights specifically. The death penalty also disproportionately affects members of vulnerable groups who cannot afford experienced defence attorneys to advocate on their behalf. There are cases of children being sentenced to death, something which is particularly important. To be clear, the use of the death penalty against juvenile offenders is against international law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, the American Convention on Human Rights, 1969, and the Convention of the Rights of the Child, 1989, all ossify this. However, Amnesty International understands that juvenile offenders are currently under sentence of death in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan and South Sudan. In addition, in 2018, Iran executed at least 7 people for crimes committed whilst they were under the age of 18, and at least 1 person in South Sudan was executed having committed a crime whilst under the age of 18. This year, Iran executed 2 17-year-old cousins, Mehdi and Amin. Both were arrested at the age of 15 and went through what might be considered an unfair trial. Whether in the name of the people or the regime, the taking of life by the state is the ultimate abuse of human rights. According to Amnesty International, China is the world's most prolific executioner, and as I highlighted earlier, the real number of state executions from 2018 could be thousands higher than the confirmed number of 690. Although China is estimated to have executed thousands last year, there is no exact figure, of course. Right now, we are seeing a battle for democracy and independence of judicial systems in Hong Kong. We are also seeing on the news many reports of the mistreatment of different ethnicities in the west of China, notably the Uyghur peoples. Credible estimates suggest that 1 million Uyghur people are being held in camps, and human rights activists continually disappear and religious belief is suppressed. Christianity, for example, has grown from 3 million believers in China in the 1980s to an estimated number of 100 million in 2018. Despite this, Human Rights Watch reports that the Chinese government crackdown on churches has intensified in the Henan province from 2018 to 2019, as authorities demolished dozens of church buildings and crosses, prevented the gathering of house churches and confiscated Bibles. In all of these cases of human rights abuses, there is great cause for concern and international response to the political suppression, disappearance of individuals and executions taking place. In times like these, and as we recognise World Death Penalty Day, it's clear to me how the role of human rights organisations such as Amnesty International UK is essential to the functioning of any democracy. My colleagues here in the Scottish Parliament, I ask you to join Amnesty International and in calling on states to abolish the death penalty and to uphold human rights across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have 8 members wanting to speak now, so we really are up against the wire. So please just understand you must do 4 minutes only. Ruth Maguire, followed by Maurice Corrie, please.
The death penalty is cruel, inhumane, degrading and a violation of human rights. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague Bill Kidd for bringing this important debate to the Chamber of the Scottish Parliament, and indeed for all the work he does for peace and justice. I'm also grateful to organisations around the world fighting every day for change. I'd like to give a special mention to Reprieve, who I had the pleasure of meeting with at the beginning of the month. Their work on the front line, investigating cases, tracking down evidence and witnesses, and the actions that they take to court, combined with public pressure, works. They've had enormous impact and have saved over 400 prisoners facing a death sentence. Every day, people are put to death in countries around the world. So-called crimes are punished by execution. That are punished by execution can include homosexuality, adultery, and blasphemy. There is a whole other debate to be had on blasphemy. However, I'd like to acknowledge that even though it's not used in modern Scotland, I do support the calls from the international humanist movement in ending all blasphemy laws around the world, including here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, every single day people are put to death in countries around the world. In Pakistan, hundreds have been hanged, including young people and those who are mentally ill. In Egypt, activists and journalists face death sentences. And of course, that great friend of Britain's, the United States of America, has states who are using untested combinations of misused medicines to kill prisoners whilst passing secrecy laws to hide their tracks. Cruel, inhuman, degrading, a violation of human rights. Authoritarian regimes regularly use the death penalty to silence those who dare oppose them. And today, I'd like to provide a snapshot of one of them, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has the dishonour of being in the worst 5 executing countries in the world for more than a decade, with more than 300 people put to death in the past 2 years. There are no signs of this getting any better. Convictions in Saudi Arabia death penalty cases often rely on confessions, false confessions coerced through torture. Those sentenced to death then suffer the further indignity of being executed in public. Execution methods in Saudi Arabia include beheading, stoning, and crucifixion. Cruel, inhuman, a degrading violation of human rights. Reprieve has raised concerns that UK funding and training for Saudi security bodies could be contributing to human rights abuses, including the death penalty. According to Reprieve, British police have trained their Saudi counterparts in investigation techniques that could lead to arrest, torture, and sentencing to death of protesters. My understanding is that concerns have been raised about the proper safeguards not being undertaken in these projects. It would be helpful if the Minister, in summing up, could confirm that in any situation Police Scotland are sharing their expertise globally, that proper safeguards are in place. After all, one of the values expressed by our Scottish force is to ensure their actions and policing operations respect the human rights of all peoples and officers, a value sadly not universally global yet.
Thank you very much. I call Maurice Corrie to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Mr Corrie, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome this opportunity to recognise the day as World Day Against the Death Penalty, and I thank Bill Kidd for bringing this motion to the Chamber today. In 1950, the European Convention on Human Rights was adopted by the Council of Europe. This convention established that members would commit to a certain standard of behaviour and protection of basic rights and freedoms for all people, regardless of race, sex, nationality or any other identifier. These rights embody the key values of our society, such as fairness, dignity, equality and respect. And our human rights are a means of protection for us all, and especially for those who are discriminated against and abused. And these rights enable us to speak up and change the society for the better. The right to life is one of the many fundamental human rights set out by the Convention. It is our most prized and dearly protected right, and one that cannot be taken lightly in any circumstance. As a ratifying member of the Convention of Human Rights, the UK has made a legal commitment to abide by the standards set out in the Convention. It is our duty to ensure that the rights of all our citizens are respected and protected. The UK's elimination of capital punishment does not only protect the human rights of Scots, but also of all who live and visit in Scotland. No matter the nationality of an offender in our nation, they are guaranteed that their human rights will not be infringed upon by our judicial system. And unfortunately, Scots are not afforded the same protection of their human rights whilst abroad. For example, in 2017, Amnesty International reported that there were 25 British nationals on death row across the world. In many of these cases, both past and present, the British government has done what it can do to intervene on behalf of its citizens in this situation. The British government not only provides legal counsel, but also makes direct pleas for clemency on behalf of nationals on death row. But these measures do not ensure that the sentence will be commuted by the detaining country, as the ultimate decision is out of the hands of the UK. Elimination of the death penalty by all countries would ensure that there is no longer needs to be that narrative. Scots will be assured of their claim to this fundamental human right without the need for government intervention. Of course, I don't believe that we can have such a small-centred perspective and focus not only on Scottish human rights. We are part of a global community, and therefore we should be aware of and do our part to protect human rights on a global scale. Amnesty International reported that there are 20 known executing countries in the past 10 years. 20 countries, when compared to 195 recognised by the UN, is a small proportion of the world still using the death penalty, which is welcome news. Unfortunately, this is not the whole story. These 20 countries have an impact on a staggering number of individuals and their rights, and their total combined population makes up approximately 35% of the world's population. This means that 35% of people still face the possibility of a state-endorsed violation of their fundamental human rights. They are subject to the reality that the death penalty is a possible penalty for even minor crimes, and they are confronted by the irrevocable nature of the death penalty and its subsequent abuse. Deputy Presiding Officer, in conclusion, we are privileged to live in a country where this is not our daily reality. Our fundamental human rights and the fairness, dignity and equality that they embody are fully protected. Much more must be done to ensure that those other countries allow their citizens that same level of respect and protection. But there is still much to do, and I hope that we can do our part to help make their reality a better and brighter future for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Alec Rowley. Mr Stevenson.
Let me start, as others have, by congratulating Bill Kidd on securing this important debate on the pressing issue of human rights. And let me also thank my intern, Claire, who joined me last week, whom I asked to look at this subject and write my speaking notes for me. Now, despite being at the forefront of the movement to abolish the death penalty, we shouldn't forget that it was actually practiced in our country until relatively recently. The last execution on Scottish soil was of Henry John Burnet in 1963, and it took until 1998 for the death penalty to be fully abolished under the European Convention on Human Rights, as we've just heard referred to. Now, while we can be proud that no injustice of this kind any longer occurs in Scotland, we mustn't fall into complacency, as we're not yet all free from the threat of the death penalty. Opposition to the death penalty is not only based on denial of human rights, but also that it sets a precedent for a more broadly vindictive society. The continued existence of capital punishment forces us to ask, in what sort of society do we wish to live, and do we wish to help others to live? The utilisation of the death penalty creates an authoritarian, brutal and regressive atmosphere that can seep into every part of life. I believe we must aim for our democracies to set an example to other countries, not democracies, that we should value compassionate justice and choose rehabilitation over retribution. Rehabilitation is difficult if that person who needs to be rehabilitated has been executed. Now, such priorities are not to be weak on crime, but actually make us better equipped to reducing it. It's no coincidence that states that still employ the death penalty have higher murder rates than those that uphold the human rights of their citizens. The argument that it provides a deterrent is one that simply isn't borne out by the evidence in countries which are democracies or claim to be, where the death penalty is still part of their criminal justice system. The motion brought to us today cites the trend towards the abolition of the death penalty. We heard that 2/3 of countries have abolished the death penalty in law or in practice. The tide is turning against the death penalty as more and more countries choose to reject such an outright denial and outright termination of human rights. 2018, Burkina Faso's National Assembly abolished the death penalty, making them the latest of many countries to move away from capital punishment. The European Union has been at the forefront of the fight against the death penalty, not only banning it in all EU member states, but being the largest donor to anti-death penalty campaigns. And indeed, in 2007, that was when October the 10th was designated European Day Against the Death Penalty. And we in Scotland, in the UK, share that commitment to protect and ensure the rights of all our citizens. Now, while progress is being made every year, Presiding Officer, at least 20 countries carried out executions in 2018, as many colleagues have referred to. As we look to the future, let this motion stand to rightfully acknowledge Scotland's firm support of the abolition of the death penalty, and we as a Parliament are part of that. I hope we continue to take the time to recognise World Action Against Death Penalty Day. Let us continue to promote and uphold human rights around the world as we push to eliminate such a cruel punishment from ever existing.
Thank you very much. And I call Alec Rowley, followed by Joan McAlpine. Mr Rowley, please.
Presiding Officer, I would also thank Bill Kidd for bringing forward this important motion and achieving the debate today. The words inscribed on the mace that sits in this chamber are compassion, wisdom, justice and integrity. These are the founding ideals of this Parliament, ideals which we all take seriously and must be central to any debate on the death penalty. Further, human rights are the foundation of our shared values of fairness, respect, equality and dignity, and they apply to everyone. In 1948, when the United Nations unanimously adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they proclaimed every individual's right to life and stated that no one should be subject to cruel or degrading punishment. There is no justification for respecting some of these rights and not respecting the most fundamental, the right to life. In February of this year, Pope Francis, in a message to the 7th Global Congress Against the Death Penalty, affirmed that the dignity of the person is not lost even if he has committed the worst of the crimes. No one can take his life and deprive him of the opportunity to embrace again the community he hurt and made suffer. I believe that we must also refuse to facilitate extradition to countries that still endorse capital punishment. Supporters of the death penalty often talk about in an abstract way, but we should never forget that the death penalty is state-authorised killing. The methods are barbaric: beheading, electrocution, hanging, lethal injection by chemicals, or shooting. The weight of the death penalty is carried disproportionately by the poor and by racial, ethnic and religious minorities, often denied proper legal representation. The unseen victims, the children whose parents have been sentenced to death or executed, were rightly highlighted by the World Day Against the Death Penalty this year. The notion of action to be in the best interests of the child is now enshrined in various human rights conventions, and this must also be considered. Politicians and others who support capital punishment often fail to confront the real causes of crime, such as poverty and inequality. The political use of the death penalty is common in countries where members of the judiciary may be elected and as such adopt a hard-line position to win votes. Our argument against the death penalty must be part of the conversation of how we propose to make communities safe while respecting the human rights of all. Justice should be available for all, regardless of economic status. Unless governments are willing to allocate proper resources to fight poverty and inequality, our communities will never be safe. Prisons are often ineffective and rehabilitating and reoffending rates are high. Here at home, our judicial system continues to improve and imprison vulnerable women rather than society investing in the services needed to provide an alternative. I will sum up, Presiding Officer, by going back to why the death penalty should never again have a place in our justice system. It is irrevocable, and there is no court system in the world that has not been guilty of terrible miscarriages of justice. We all know the long list of such miscarriages of justice in our own country. The Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 come to mind. There is no evidence to say that capital punishment works as a deterrent, as Stuart Stevenson has said. This debate has provided a welcome opportunity for the Scottish Parliament to add its voice to all those who spoke out so clearly on the 10th of October, the World Day of Action Against the Death Penalty. And once again, I would thank Bill Kidd for bringing this motion forward.
Thank you very much. I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by John Finney. Ms McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate Bill Kidd on securing this debate. I strongly oppose the death penalty, like others who have spoken, because I believe no one has the right to take a human life. It's a grim thought that in 2019 people are executed around the world every 4 hours, every day. That includes innocent people such as political activists, journalists, human rights lawyers, gay people in some theocratic regimes conducting an extramarital relationship can result in execution. But the figure also includes people convicted of serious crimes. In many cases, the justice and penal systems under which they were convicted and then imprisoned can be deeply flawed and inhumane. Sometimes these people wait a long time for the awful sentence to be carried out. International law now recognises that the mental trauma of impending death and lengthy incarceration causes mental health deterioration, known as death row phenomenon. Developing international jurisprudence says that this in itself constitutes cruel, inhumane or degrading punishment prohibited by international law under Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 6 of the same covenant provides that the death penalty can only be used in very restricted circumstances. This has provided a framework for some countries to move away from mandatory executions to give individualised consideration to a convicted person's character, record and circumstances. However, it is clear that individualised consideration is compromised for many people who have either a mental illness or an intellectual disability. While customary international law prohibits the execution of mentally ill people and people with severe intellectual disabilities, there are several resolutions adopted by the UN Commission on Human Rights urging all states not to execute any such person, but some countries continue to convict them. Why? Mentally ill people are much more likely to confess to crimes that they did not commit, and that also applies to people with intellectual disabilities. They are much less likely to be able to meaningfully assist their lawyers. These defendants are also more likely to be poor, present as hostile and be perceived as lacking in remorse. Crucially, there is little data to tell us how many people such as these are executed globally because of the dearth of qualified mental health professionals in executing countries. Individuals are not assessed properly within penal systems, and mental illness and intellectual disabilities are not documented. Such spectacular systemic prejudice against people with mental illness or intellectual disabilities in executing countries must somehow be amplified in the debate, especially given recent analysis of the global picture showing an increase in death penalty use around the world. In 2018, 4 executions took place in Belarus, the first in the region since 2005. In the Asian Pacific region, executions tripled in Japan, and there was an overall increase across that region. In Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iraq, there was an 89% increase in executions, and in the US, federal executions resumed in 2019. Here in Scotland, the death penalty was abolished in 1969, but there is no room for complacency. A 2019 poll revealed that, in fact, 41% of Scots favoured the reintroduction of the death penalty. And in the UK, there has been a rise in pro-death penalty support since the EU referendum in 2016. That is extremely worrying. The death penalty is cruel, inhuman and degrading, and a violation of the inherent right to life. In my view, it is wrong per se, and that's why I am very pleased to be able to speak in this debate and pleased that Bill Kidd has achieved it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call John Finney to be followed by John Mason. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you very much, indeed, Presiding Officer. I'll start by referring members to my register of interest, my long-standing membership of Amnesty, and join with others in congratulating Bill Kidd in bringing this motion. I don't think anything's lost by the fact that it didn't take place on the day it was scheduled. Indeed, it's an everyday trauma that faces many communities around the world that this remains. And I also want to align it with, there was another comment made about Bill's other work in relation to nuclear disarmament and peace, because the terms often used about deterrence, and I think, forgive me, I forget which member that mentioned it, Mr Stevenson, I think, that about the effectiveness. Now, we know that the possession of nuclear weapons isn't a deterrent to terrorist acts, just as we know that a state that sanctions violence against its citizens is nonetheless likely to face high levels of violence in that. So I would like to focus in the very brief time we have on young people, and we know that the use of the death penalty for crimes committed by people excuse me, younger than 18 is prohibited under international law, yet it takes place. So setting aside that particular abhorrent act, the significance goes beyond the number of deaths and calls into question, of course, those states' respect for international law, full stop. And I'm grateful to our Amnesty for a briefing, since 1990, Amnesty International has documented 145 executions of children in 10 countries. I'll read these in alphabetical order. China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iran, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, South Sudan, Sudan, the USA and Yemen. Now, several of these countries have changed their laws in relation to that. And, you know, it's in my mind a picture that I saw someone post on Facebook recently that people will be familiar, a very celebrated case of George Junius Stinney Jr., a boy, excuse me, whose conviction was overturned 70 years later, literally fried in a chair holding a Bible. Now, I've been described as a man with no faith. That is, I'm not of an adherence to any organised religion, but I have to say I would struggle to understand that there would be any theological basis to to taking someone else's life. And, you know, if from a childhood brought up in a house that was religious, you know, two wrongs don't make a right would be something that would strike me as being important. Of course, there's an obligation to provide public protection. But of course, as others have said, the people who have found themselves vulnerable to this system are from a very select and much maligned group of people. The young man I referred to was a young black boy convicted wrongly of killing two young white girls in one of the states in America. And I think we can all reasonably safely say that had the background of these individuals been changed, it's unlikely that a white child would have been. So the deterrence isn't appropriate. Often, as others have said, this has been brought about by lack of legal representation because people haven't been best placed to, excuse me, to inform their legal advisors. And of course, it's often been aligned to torture, bringing about the false confessions. So what can we do about it? Well, I think we must send a very clear signal about the kind of society we want. I think there's been some excellent contributions here. I know that the Minister, when they're speaking, won't go, this isn't anything to do with us, international affairs, because I know that the Scottish Government, well, I'm hopeful, I know that the Scottish Government in previous occasions has made representations to countries where there have been significant human rights abuses. And that's one way that we can do it. Of course, lead by example, as Maurice Corrie says, but do our very best to provide the very highest standard of human rights around the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. John Mason, followed by Gil Patterson. Mr Patterson is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much, and I thank Bill Kidd for initiating this debate. Can I firstly say I want to state clearly that I unreservedly endorse Amnesty International's statement when they say we oppose the death penalty in all cases without exception, regardless of the nature of the crime. I note in the Amnesty briefing that they have found it difficult in several countries to get the actual number of sentences carried out, and I would want to equally condemn a country like North Korea, where prisoners are understood to be intentionally worked or starved to death, or China, where there is evidence of organ harvesting, where prisoners are deliberately killed for their organs. I would just skip over and endorse what others have said, that it does not actually work, and that, of course, it is irreversible. However, I thought I would make a slightly different direction from others today by making a few comments from a faith perspective on this. A number of faiths have scriptures which do appear to support the death penalty for certain crimes. Christianity, Judaism and Islam would be among these. However, on closer examination, we see that for the Christian faith, there is both an Old Testament and a New Testament. The former, largely similar to Jewish scriptures, does include provision for the death penalty. However, when Jesus was questioned about some of these Old Testament teachings, he said that they had been allowed because of our hardness of heart, and he was now expecting a higher standard. He taught that we should be ready to forgive our enemies, including people who had done terrible things to us. It is following that kind of teaching that even some survivors of the Holocaust were able to forgive their prison guards and persecutors, frankly something that many of us would find hard to comprehend. We often hear people saying that all they want is justice. However, that can very easily slip into wanting revenge. Things like, I lost my child through murder, so that family should lose theirs too. That is in many ways understandable, but we do not want our justice system to be like that. Another angle of Christian teaching is that people can change. In the Bible itself, we see someone like Paul, who had been heavily involved in persecuting Christians, who actually happened also to be Jews at the time. However, God met him and changed his whole perspective. He confessed his sin, sought forgiveness, and was given new life. At that point, he had metaphorically died to his old life and had been presented with a new one, as a free gift. So this is a key reason why I personally am opposed to the death penalty. Even if someone is hugely evil and has carried out murder or other horrendous crimes, they can change. If we end their life as a punishment, which you can argue they might actually deserve, then we remove the opportunity for them to change. So in conclusion, I welcome the fact that we're having today's debate. I deplore the use of the death penalty, and I hope we will see a continuing reduction in its use throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Call Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer, for letting me in this very important debate. And thanks, Bill, for bringing forward this debate for us to consider today. Presiding Officer, the notion that someone who has taken a life deserves the loss of their own life would seem to be a fair balance of justice. However, over my lifetime, from time of capital punishment to no death penalty for murder, I have witnessed miscarriage of justice that proves the opposite of quid pro quo. One of the most harrowing outcomes that shatters the myth of fair justice was the case of Stefan Kiczko, who was arrested and found guilty of rape and murder of a 12-year-old child. Mr. Kiczko was 23 when this crime was carried out, and I remember well the case, and I was mighty relieved that the courts had jailed Mr. Kiczko from this particular horrendous crime, like many, many others in the country. 17 years later, Mr. Kiczko was taken from prison to hospital with a fairly serious illness that required a full and thorough examination. Mr. Kiczko had been convicted mainly on the basis that his sperm was left on the victim's clothing. The medical examination discovered that Mr. Kiczko did not have the capacity, nor did he ever have the capacity, due to the lack of male paraphernalia, to either rape somebody or to indeed produce any sperm whatever. When he was charged, he was aged 23, with a mental age and emotional age of 12 years old. Should the death penalty have been available then, this totally innocent, in real terms, child would have been executed and no one would have been any the wiser. He would have gone. Mr. Kiczko was released when he was 43. Only 2 people were ever convinced he was innocent, that one being his mother and the other his lawyer, and both had stood by him throughout, right to the end. If someone still believes in the death sentence after being aware of this case, then I only personally feel sorry for them. Mr. Kiczko died 18 months after being released, quickly followed, unfortunately, by his mother, and neither of them ever seen the light of the day of the £500,000 that the state had paid for hits that the state sellers. The death sentence had just ended 7 years prior to this, before this murder case, and there was much pressure throughout the country to bring the death penalty back on, based on that one single case. Now, if this boy had been executed, it would have been the state murdering a completely, in real terms, innocent child. So as they say in court, I rest my case.
Thank you very much. And I thank members for keeping their time. I call on Christina McKelvey to close the debate up to 2 o'clock, please, Minister.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you so much to Bill Kidd for bringing the motion forward. And I know it was delayed from the 10th of October, but rightly so, that every day is a day that we should focus our attention on that. And I thank him for all the work he does in raising awareness of not just this issue, but all the other issues in which he has mentored and been an inspiration to me over the years on the work that he has done. So thank you for that. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government strongly opposes the death penalty in all circumstances, a matter of fundamental principle. And I want to say that at the outset because it's absolutely clear that that's the position that we hold within our government here. The death penalty is barbaric and inhumane and is a grievous violation of human rights. Treatment before and during execution itself amounts to inhumane and degrading treatment, and that was raised in this debate today by Joan McAlpine, and that impact that can have on people who are waiting, you know, on death row is the usual term that's used. There is clear evidence that the most vulnerable and marginalised in society are very disproportionately affected by the death penalty around the world. And this has been highlighted by Bill Kidd, Ruth Maguire, Alex Rowley and Joe McAlpine, but most powerfully in the testimony we've just heard from Gil Patterson and his words about Stefan Kiczko. We should never forget that name when we talk about, you know, the drive to push maybe in some areas to bring back the death penalty. Presiding Officer, the right to life and freedom from torture are both protected by the European Convention on Human Rights under EU law and by the United Nations treaties. The Scottish Government calls on all states to follow the lead of the UK, the EU and the Council of Europe and Scotland in its it's time to outlaw the death penalty in every situation. Can I highlight, Presiding Officer, the important work of Amnesty, which has been highlighted by many in the Chamber today. But in their report published in April, it confirmed that 690 executions took place in 2018 across 20 countries. We are not sure if that's the real number. That was the numbers that they could get. This is the lowest recorded number by Amnesty in the last decade, and we welcome that progress. However, 690 recorded deaths through the death penalty is 690 too many. Sadly, some countries have increased their use of the death penalty, and the number of death sentences remains almost the same as it was in the previous year. And we've heard powerful testimony from Bill Kidd today about child executions and the propensity for some countries to continue those, and the impact that then has on everybody involved. Nevertheless, Presiding Officer, campaigning by human rights organisations is making a difference. In 1977, when Amnesty still started its work, only 16 countries had totally abolished the death penalty. Now, 106, more than half of the world's countries, have abolished it completely, and more than two-thirds are either abolitionist in law or have not carried out an execution in the last 10 years. And we should highlight that progress whilst being mindful that there's always more work to do. The right to life and freedom from torture, inhuman or degraded treatment and punishment are bare minimums that we should all expect from every country. Abolishing gross human rights abuses, such as the death penalty, established a basic threshold of decency, which we've heard a lot about in the Chamber today. But such actions, as I said, are the bare minimum. But Stuart Stevenson and Alec Rowley both talked about compassion in our justice system and how that's paramount to everything that we do. And everyone should have the right to live, certainly, but more than this, everyone should have the right to live with dignity. That broad approach is shared by the UN Committee Against Torture, whose remit goes beyond the narrow focus of conditions in detention to include violence against women and girls, human trafficking, hate crime, areas in which this Scottish Government is taking decisive and world-leading action. A right to live with dignity means the full realisation of all human rights for all people equally, not just in Scotland but across all nations. And Alec Rowley reminded us of the words of Pope Francis and how dignity is important to everything that we do too. Members will be aware that the Scottish Government has established a national task force for human rights leadership, which I am delighted to be a member of. We met for the first time just last month and agreed our remit to develop legislation for a human rights framework for Scotland that will bring internationally recognised human rights into our domestic law. And that work really is about leadership. It is about demonstrating that Scotland not only meets its own obligation, but helps to set international standards from which everyone can benefit. And it's my hope that coordinated approach will make that difference. And to reassure John Finney, our progress towards full incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and his valuable and welcomed work in the Equal Protection Act, which will become an act very, very soon, sends a clear message about who we are, but the message that we send to the rest of the world that we're a global leader here. Can I pick up on the very important point that Ruth Maguire raised in her contribution about police training, specifically in Saudi Arabia? Police Scotland's international activity supports building mutually beneficial partnerships with law enforcement agencies overseas. The training in question that she spoke about occurred in 2011 in Scotland. It was focused solely on advanced driver and road police and forensic investigative training programmes. And this is in line with the Scottish Government's international framework, which includes sharing of Scottish knowledge, skills and technical expertise for global good. But can I reassure her, as a good global citizen, the Scottish Government is committed to securing democracy, the rule of law and human rights across the world. So we would expect Police Scotland, and we do, to carry out due diligence as a matter of course and to exercise sound judgments in overseas dealings. The Scottish Government ensures that due diligence has been carried out to assess the human rights credentials of the individuals, organisations or governments we are engaging with overseas. And we expect other public bodies to take similar account of human rights considerations. All overseas training provided by Police Scotland undergoes a human rights risk assessment, and they ensure that the ethics, values, equality and human rights are interwoven throughout all of that training. So taking some of our work into countries that maybe need to hear some of those explanations. Police Scotland, as I said, has not conducted any police training in Saudi Arabia and has no plans to deliver any police training in Saudi Arabia either. So I hope that would reassure my colleague Ruth Maguire on that. Presiding Officer, to close and to meet your deadline on point, the Scottish Government encourages all states to join the general trend towards moratoriums and executions. In fact, we call on all states to take action to abolish the death penalty entirely within their jurisdictions for every reason. This debate has been a very important debate, a very important opportunity to record this Scottish Parliament's views condemning any and every use of the death penalty. Let us all add our voices to the international campaign to end this barbaric punishment and to outlaw its use in every circumstance in every nation in our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on World Day Against the Death Penalty, and it's time to move on to the next item of business with a very short suspension to let members take their places.